Here is the script. Physics explained simply. Deep focus and concentration techniques inspired by Richard Feynman's methods. You are being robbed, right now. Not of your money, not of your time in the conventional sense, but of something far more precious. You are being robbed of your ability to think deeply. And the thief? It's sitting in your pocket, buzzing on your wrist, glowing on your desk. It has notifications. It has infinite scroll. It has been engineered with extraordinary precision to make sure you never ever sit alone with a hard problem long enough to actually solve it. Here's what nobody in the attention economy wants you to know. The greatest scientific mind of the 20th century had no smartphone. He had no email. He had no social media. And yet, Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, safecracker, bongo drummer, and arguably the most brilliant explainer of complex ideas who ever lived, solved problems that stumped entire teams of scientists. He worked through quantum electrodynamics while sitting in cafeterias, drawing diagrams on paper napkins. He cracked some of the hardest conceptual locks in all of physics by doing something radical, something almost subversive in today's world. He sat with problems, deeply, patiently, completely. And today, we are going to learn exactly how he did it. Why this matters more than ever. Before we dive into the mechanics of deep focus, let's be honest about the world we're actually living in. The average person in the United States now checks their phone over 96 times per day. That's once every 10 minutes during waking hours. Research from the University of California, Irvine, has shown that after a single interruption, it takes an average of 23 minutes to return to a task at full cognitive depth. Do the math on that? If you're being interrupted every 10 minutes but it takes 23 minutes to recover, you are spending your entire day in a state of perpetual cognitive shallow water. You never go deep. You never touch the bottom where the real thinking lives. Feynman understood something that neuroscience has only recently confirmed. Deep thinking is not just thinking harder. It is a different neurological state entirely. It is a mode of engagement with reality that requires as a prerequisite the complete removal of cognitive noise. And he didn't just stumble onto this accidentally. He cultivated it. He protected it. He treated his capacity for focused thought the way an athlete treats their body, as a precious, trainable, protectable resource. So what exactly did he do? And more importantly, what can you do? Let's start at the foundation. The fundamental problem with how most people think here is a thought experiment. Imagine you are handed a map of a city you've never visited. You study it for 3 minutes. Someone takes it away. No, someone asks you to navigate from the train station to the museum. Most people in that situation would feel anxious. They'd want the map back. They'd want to keep glancing at it. They'd feel uncomfortable holding the problem in their head without external support. Now imagine someone who grew up in that city. No map needed. The knowledge is inside them. It is structural, deep, and available on demand. This is the difference Feynman identified between what he called fragile knowledge and robust understanding. Most of us, when we learn something, a physics formula, a historical fact, a programming concept, we learn the surface. We learn the label. We learn the map. But we never build the internal city. Feynman had a name for this phenomenon. He called it knowing the name of something versus knowing something. He used to tell a story about his father, who taught him as a child that knowing what a bird is called in 15 different languages tells you nothing about the bird. It tells you nothing about how it moves, what it eats, how it raises its young, how its feathers trap air. The name is a filing cabinet. Understanding is what's inside the drawer. And here's the brutal implication of that distinction. If your knowledge is mostly labels and not structures, deep focus becomes almost impossible, because deep focus requires you to engage with the underlying machinery of a problem. You have to be able to hold moving parts in your mind simultaneously, rotate them, stress test them, break them, and rebuild them. If all you have is a label, there's nothing to hold. Your mind slips off the surface of the problem like water off glass. This is why the first step to Feynman-level concentration is not a productivity hack. It's not a timer app or a focus playlist. It is a commitment to building genuine understanding before you try to think deeply. The Feynman Technique as a focus engine. Most people have heard of the Feynman Technique as a learning method. You take a concept, explain it in simple language as if to a child, identify where your explanation breaks down, Go back to the source material, fill the gap, and explain again. Repeat until the explanation is clear, simple, and complete. But here's what most people miss. This technique is not just a learning tool. It is a focused training system. Think about what happens neurologically when you attempt to explain a concept simply. Your brain cannot coast, it cannot skim, it cannot rely on vague familiarity. The moment you open your mouth, or put pen to paper, and try to explain, say, why gravity curves space rather than just pulling objects, every gap in your understanding becomes immediately, painfully visible. Your mind hits a wall. It stutters. You reach for words and find fog. That moment of stuttering, that moment of fog, is one of the most valuable cognitive experiences available to a human being, because it is the exact moment your brain identifies a real problem to solve, and real problems are the engine of deep focus. Feynman once said that he never really understood something until he could explain it simply, but what he was really describing was the act of using explanation as a diagnostic tool. You talk your way through a problem until the problem becomes clear, and then, and only then, do you have something concrete enough to focus on. Stop. Think about that for a moment. Most people try to focus on vague, cloudy problems and then wonder why their attention keeps drifting. Of course it drifts. Attention is attracted to definition. Blur is repellent to the focused mind. The sharper and more concrete your problem, the more naturally your attention locks onto it. This is practical gold. Before your next deep work session, spend 10 minutes writing out in plain, simple language exactly what problem you are trying to solve. Not vaguely. Specifically. Not, I need to understand quantum mechanics. Instead, I need to understand why an electron in a double-slit experiment appears to interfere with itself and what that implies about the nature of physical reality. Now you have a hook. Now you have something to grab onto. Feynman's secret weapon, strategic solitude, and the permission to struggle. Here's something about Feynman that surprises people when they first learn it. He was, by all accounts, a deeply social, energetic, exuberant human being. He loved parties. He loved music. He loved conversation. He was not a reclusive, antisocial genius sitting alone in a tower. And yet, when it came time to think, really think, he built walls around himself that were nearly impenetrable. At Caltech, where he spent the bulk of his career, Feynman became famous for disappearing. He would find a corner of the cafeteria, pull out a notebook, and enter a state that his colleagues described as being simply not there. Not rude, not unfriendly, just elsewhere. He had the ability to be physically present in a noisy social environment and mentally present in a completely different universe, the universe of the problem in front of him. How? This is the crucial question. The answer, as best as can be reconstructed from his own accounts and those of people who worked with him, comes down to three interlocking habits. The first is what we might call problem saturation. Before attempting to focus deeply, Feynman would immerse himself in a problem almost casually for an extended period. He would carry it around mentally, not straining to solve it, but simply letting it marinate. He would think about it on walks, in the shower, while playing the bongos. This preparatory period was not idle. It was priming the cognitive pump. When he finally sat down to focus, his subconscious mind had already been working on the problem for hours or days. The deep work session was not the beginning of the thinking, it was the harvest. This is directly relevant to you. One of the reasons deep focus feels so hard is that we try to go from zero to depth instantly. We sit down, open a document, and expect profound insight to flow immediately. But the mind doesn't work that way. You need to prime it. Live with your problem before you try to solve it. Let it occupy background processing. Make it your mental companion on the commute, on the run, in the moments between tasks. The second habit is what might be called the permission to not know. Feynman was extraordinarily comfortable with uncertainty. He famously said that he was perfectly happy to not know the answer, that the not knowing, far from being threatening, was where all the excitement lived. This is a radically different relationship with intellectual discomfort than most people have. Think about what happens when most people hit a point of genuine confusion in their thinking. They stop, they Google it immediately, they reach for a shortcut to resolution. The discomfort of not knowing becomes intolerable within seconds, and the moment they reach for the external answer, They short-circuit the very neurological process that would have led to deep understanding. Feynman let himself not know. He sat with confusion. He turned it over and looked at it from multiple angles. He would ask himself, what do I know for certain? What can I derive from that? What is the smallest, simplest version of this confusion? By treating confusion not as a failure state, but as a rich information source, he transformed it into fuel for sustained focus. Here is a thought experiment to make this visceral. Imagine you are handed a locked box and told there is something extraordinary inside. You cannot look it up. You cannot ask anyone. The only tool you have is your own thinking. Now imagine you try the first combination and it doesn't work. Do you throw the box away? Of course not. You try the next one. And the next. The locked box is not an obstacle to engagement. The locked box is the thing that keeps you engaged. Confusion, genuine intellectual confusion, is a locked box, and the act of staying with it, refusing to immediately Google, refusing to immediately defer, is the act of building your focus muscles in real time. The third habit is environment as signal. Feynman used physical and contextual cues to shift his cognitive state. The notebook coming out, the pen in hand, the specific posture he adopted. These were not incidental, they were ritualistic triggers. His brain, through repetition, had learned to associate these cues with the state of deep engagement. The moment the notebook opened, something shifted neurologically. The world narrowed. The problem expanded. This is entirely replicable. You don't need Feynman's genius to use his method. You need consistency. The same chair, the same time of day, the same ritual of clearing the desk, closing the browser, writing the problem statement at the top of the page. Do this enough times, and your brain begins to anticipate the state. The ritual becomes the on-ramp to depth. Eliminating distractions, the physics of attention. Let's talk about distractions with the same rigor we'd apply to any physical system, because attention, it turns out, obeys something very much like physical laws. Here's the principle. Attention flows toward the highest intensity stimulus in the environment. This is not a character flaw. This is not laziness. This is the fundamental operating principle of the human nervous system, refined over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Your ancestors survived because they paid attention to sudden movements, unexpected sounds, and novel stimuli. The brain that ignored the rustling in the grass got eaten. The brain that snapped to attention lived to pass on its genes. Your smartphone is a rustling in the grass machine. Every notification, every buzz, every little red badge is a perfectly engineered trigger for this ancient reflex. It is not competing with your focus on a level playing field. It is cheating. It is using your own evolutionary wiring against you. Understanding this changes the strategic picture entirely. The solution is not willpower. The solution is not trying harder to resist. The solution is environmental design. You cannot reliably outperform a system that has been engineered with billions of dollars of behavioral research behind it. So you remove it from the environment. The phone goes in another room. The internet router gets unplugged. The notifications get killed, completely and permanently, not paused. But here's where it gets interesting, and where most productivity advice misses something critical. Physical distraction removal is necessary but not sufficient. Because even in a silent room with a phone in another building, most people still cannot focus deeply. Why? Because the distraction has been internalized. It lives inside the skull now. Years of chronic context switching train the mind to interrupt itself. Even without external triggers, the mind begins generating its own interruptions, sudden urges to check the time, random thoughts about unrelated tasks, micro daydreams about lunch or the weekend. The external tool has created an internal habit. Feynman's approach to this internal noise was deceptively simple. He acknowledged it without fighting it. When a distracting thought arose, he did not try to suppress it. Suppression takes cognitive energy and typically strengthens the thought through what psychologists call the ironic process. Instead, he had a small notebook, separate from his working notebook, where he would simply write the intrusive thought down. One sentence. Then return to the problem. The act of writing the thought down does something elegant to the brain. It signals completion. The anxious looping quality of an intrusive thought often exists because the brain is afraid it will be forgotten. When you write it down, the brain relaxes. The thought has been filed. It can be returned to later, and now the present moment is free. This is a thought experiment worth trying right now. Think about the last time you sat down to do something complex and found your mind wandering. What were the intrusive thoughts? Almost universally, they are things you are afraid to forget or tasks you are worried about dropping. They are not random. They are the mind's attempt to manage load, give them a home, get them out of working memory and onto the page, and watch the clarity that follows, engaging with problems at the fundamental level. Now we come to the most profound and least discussed aspect of Feynman's approach, his insistence on working from first principles. Most people, when confronted with a complex problem, approach it through the layer of existing frameworks. We use the maps other people have drawn. We apply the formulas we were taught. We navigate by authorities and received wisdom. This is not foolish, it's efficient most of the time. But it has a fatal weakness. It makes genuine deep thinking almost impossible. Here is why. When you work from an existing framework, you are not really engaging with the problem. You are engaging with someone else's solution to a prior version of the problem. You are playing a game with other people's rules on other people's board. Your mind is not truly grappling with reality. It is grappling with a representation of a representation. Feynman refused to do this. When he encountered a new topic, he would deliberately set aside the standard textbooks and try to derive the results himself, from scratch, using only the most fundamental principles he trusted. Not because the textbooks were wrong, often they weren't, but because the act of derivation built something that reading never could, a visceral, personal, structural understanding of why the result was true. He described this in the context of mathematics. When most students learn a mathematical result, they learn it as a fact. This is the formula. Here is when to apply it. Feynman learned it as a story. Here is where this formula comes from. Here is the problem it was invented to solve. Here is what goes wrong if you try to do it any other way. The formula for him was not a tool to be applied. It was a compressed story to be understood. And here is the extraordinary byproduct of this approach. When you understand something at that level, when you have built it from the ground up in your own mind, you cannot be distracted from it, because it is no longer external information sitting on the surface of your consciousness. It has become part of the architecture of your thinking. It is inside. And engaging with it is not effort in the conventional sense. It is something closer to play. This is the deepest secret of sustained concentration. The most focused people in the world are not people with superior willpower. They are people who have fallen in love with their problems. They are people for whom engagement is not a discipline, but a gravitational attraction. And that gravitational attraction is built, almost always, through the process of deep, first principles engagement. You don't fall in love with a label. You fall in love with an idea you have wrestled with personally, struggled with, and finally understood on your own terms. Maintaining sustained attention, the long game. We've talked about how to get into depth. Now let's talk about how to stay there. Here is another thought experiment. Imagine you are a deep-sea diver. You have done the preparation, you have the equipment, You are finally at depth, in the world beneath the surface, where the extraordinary things live. How long can you stay? The honest answer for most people today is not very long. We have atrophied. Years of shallow engagement have shortened our attention spans, the way years of inactivity shorten physical endurance. The good news, and this is genuinely good news, is that attention, like physical fitness, responds to training. You can rebuild it. You just have to do it systematically. Feynman worked in what we would now call ultra-long focus blocks, often 3 or 4 hours of unbroken engagement, but he did not start that way. He built that capacity over years of deliberate practice, and the mechanism he used, almost without knowing it, was what modern cognitive scientists call progressive overload of the attention span. The principle is simple. Start with the amount of focused time you can genuinely sustain, even if that's only 20 minutes. Work deeply for that period. Then stop. Rest completely. No phone, no email, no media, a walk, a cup of tea, silence. Then return for another block. Over weeks and months, extend the blocks. The brain adapts, the capacity deepens. But here is the critical nuance that Feynman embodied and that most productivity advice gets wrong. The quality of the rest period matters as much as the quality of the work period. His walks were not wasted time. His bongo sessions were not distractions. They were, in neurological terms, periods of diffuse mode thinking, a state in which the prefrontal cortex relaxes its tight grip and allows the deeper, associative networks of the brain to run in the background. Many of Feynman's most celebrated insights came not in the middle of intense focus, but immediately after it, in the transition from focused to relaxed states. The classic shower eureka phenomenon, the answer that arrives on the walk after you finally stop trying to force it. This is not mystical. This is the brain's associative architecture doing its best work when the conscious mind steps back. So the sustained attention picture is not one of unbroken grinding. It is one of deep cycles, intense, complete engagement followed by genuine, complete rest. Like breathing, in and out, deep work and deep rest. Neither half of the cycle is optional. The analog antidote: we live in an age of information abundance and attention poverty. We have more data at our fingertips than any human civilization has ever possessed, and we are less capable of thinking deeply with it than at almost any prior point in history. That is not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of the architecture of the digital environment. Feynman worked in an analog world, and there is something in that analog texture worth recovering, not out of nostalgia, but out of neuroscience. Writing by hand activates different and deeper encoding mechanisms than typing. The slower pace of handwriting forces you to process and compress information. You cannot transcribe everything, so you are forced to select, which is itself a form of thinking. Drawing diagrams, the kind Feynman filled notebooks with, activates spatial reasoning in ways that digital note-taking never does. There is also something important about the physical irreversibility of handwriting. When you write something down in a notebook, you are making a commitment. You cannot Command Z it. That commitment, however small, changes your relationship to the thought. You own it more. You've chosen to give it space in a physical object that will still exist tomorrow. Feynman's notebooks were not organized files or productivity systems. They were thinking tools, messy, looping, recursive records of a mind in motion. He would write a question, then try to answer it, then discover that the answer raised a new question, then pursue that one. The notebook was the externalized working memory of a mind operating at the edge of its capacity. It made the invisible visible. It made the fleeting permanent enough to examine. If you do one thing differently tomorrow, let it be this: buy a notebook, a real one, paper. Close the laptop for an hour. Write down one problem you are genuinely curious about in simple, honest language. Then start talking to it on paper, the way Feynman did. Ask questions. Try to answer them. Notice where you get stuck. Go back. Try again. You will be stunned by what happens when you give your mind the quiet and the space and the friction of the analog world. Thoughts that have been churning below the surface for weeks will suddenly become visible. Connections that were obscured by the noise of the digital environment will emerge, blinking, into the light. The deeper implication. Now, here is where the story gets philosophically rich. Because Feynman's approach to focus was not really about productivity. It was not about getting more done or optimizing output. It was about something far more profound. It was about the quality of the relationship between a human mind and physical reality. Feynman believed with genuine passion that the universe was structured in such a way that a sufficiently attentive mind could understand it. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely and deeply. That the laws of physics were not arbitrary mysteries available only to a credentialed elite, but were at their core accessible to anyone willing to pay the price of attention and honest thinking. This is a radical and beautiful idea. It implies that every time you sit down, close the notifications, open the notebook, and genuinely engage with a difficult problem, you are participating in something that transcends productivity. You are enacting one of the most fundamentally human activities available to you, the attempt to understand the world from the inside on your own terms, with your own mind. The scattered, distracted, notification-driven mode of modern life is not just inefficient, it is impoverishing. It cuts you off from the experience of genuine intellectual depth. It leaves you at the surface of everything and the bottom of nothing. And the bottom, the place where Feynman spent most of his intellectual life, is where the extraordinary things live, the unexpected connections, the moments of sudden clarity, the experience of understanding something so deeply that it becomes part of you. The invitation. You do not have to be Richard Feynman to think like Richard Feynman, to think like Richard Feynman. You do not need his IQ or his training or his particular genius. What you need is what he had in abundance and what the modern world is conspiring to take from you: time with hard problems, patience with confusion, and the discipline to stay in the deep water long enough to see what lives there. Start small. 1 hour tomorrow, phone in another room, notebook open. One genuinely interesting problem written at the top of the page in honest, specific language. And then, just begin. Not perfectly, not with all the answers. Just begin. The capacity for deep focus is not a talent. It is a practice. And like all practices, it rewards those who return to it again and again, with faithfulness and patience and the willingness to sit with the uncomfortable, generative, extraordinary experience of not yet knowing. That is the Feynman way, and it is available to you right now. If this way of thinking about focus and learning resonates with you, there is so much more waiting in the universe of ideas that Feynman spent his life illuminating. Stick around, go deep. The surface is fine, but the bottom is where it gets truly beautiful.